Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome to Fresh Start Monday here. Before we get started, I just want to show what is shown on the end of each episode of Making a Murder Season 2. And they just show all the people's names who declined to be in the series or speak with them. So, all the usual suspects on here. You got Colburn, Lank, Wiegert, Fassbender, Kulane, Bobby Dassey, Ryan Hillegas, Bloedorn, gone. And interesting that, I guess not so interesting, but all the Hallbox declined. Poggle, a lot of people declined to speak with the series, and I find it interesting for people who may have received a lot of backlash from the first Making a Murder and maybe would want to clear things up or maybe get something off their chest, but obviously that was not the case. How's it going? Thanks for joining me today, taking some time out of your day to watch one of my videos. Um, I've been getting a lot of comments from all the videos I've done on Making a Murder, and this one is absolutely going to be the longest Making a Murder video I've ever done. And I want to give you a little layout of how this is going to go down today with my video. We're going to talk about Scott Bloedorn, that is Teresa Hallbach's ex-roommate. She did have a sexual relationship with Scott Bloedorn. Two, we're going to talk about Kathleen Zellners' motion for post-conviction relief. More importantly, the Denny law regarding Ryan Hillegas and why he may have been a suspect. Three, Ken Kratz and Tom Fassbender's interview with Crime Watch Daily. We're going to decipher that a little bit. And the last part is going to be Ken Kratz's sexual text messages to domestic abuse victim. I just want to warn you, the middle part of this video is very long. It's a lot of talking and reading. I'm going to put videos and pictures up to make it a little less dry and give my take after each reading. But if you're a Making a Murder fan and you want more Making a Murder and you want to know what she actually filed regarding Ryan Hillegas, maybe break this up, watch it a couple of days, and just hear it out, because it is all interesting and it really does put everything that we've been seeing in the movies and things we've read together and what her ideas, what actually happened. All right, so we'll get started here. First thing I want to do before I get into those four things that I talked about is show this video of Steven being interviewed. This is when Teresa went missing. There's clips of this throughout the documentaries, and you've seen them before probably, but I just want to play it because I think it's important.
You can look at me. You've done this 1,000 times.
Yeah. Diana, come for me a little bit. There we go.
Okay. So my first question to you is, how did you know Teresa?
Well, Teresa used to come out with here all the time, take pictures of my vehicles, and to put them in the book.
Okay, so how long have you known her?
I've been using the book for a year, a little over a year maybe, somewhere in there.
And when she came out here, was she all business? What was your personality like?
Same thing every time.
Okay, so how did you first hear that she disappeared?
When the cops came up by the house by my mom and dad, then they asked me if she was out here and that, and I said yeah. And then they asked me what time. Around 2:30.
So does he look and sound like someone who's guilty and hiding something?
Okay. So what kinds of questions were police asking you?
This one, she was out here, what time, around. And that was about it.
Did they ask you to take a polygraph or anything like that?
No. Well, tonight, the cops come and they asked me if I remember anything. And I told them no. And then they asked me if they can come in the house and check the house over. I said, oh, I got no problem with that. Come on in. So they checked the house all over. Everything was fine, and they left.
If they asked you to take a polygraph, would you? Would you not? And why?
I don't know. I got nothing to hide. They want me to, but I don't care.
The man has literally no issue with them without a warrant going into his place, looking around. And if you remember, initially Ken Kratz and the prosecution was going off of Brendan Dassey and saying how they raped and killed her and her neck was cut in the bedroom. But he just let them walk right in a very close time frame from when she went missing to when he would actually have committed this crime if he did.
So when you heard about it, how did you feel?
It's too close to home, something happening. It's not good. Everybody locks their doors now around here. It's pretty bad when something happens around here. I can see somewhere else, but this is too close to home. And you get a little worried, and your family.
And it doesn't, knowing her, what are your feelings for her parents? And
they must be going through hell. I figure my mom, my dad, and everybody else, my family, they went through hell when I went did 18 years for something I didn't do. I figured they're going through probably the same thing because they lost somebody or whatever. She's got to be out there somewhere, so somebody should be looking.
Does it strike you as weird? Do you think this is kind of odd?
Yeah. But there's stuff happening in the world all over. But this is too close to home for me. And I'm involved. I don't feel good. Then I got all the heat on me again. I did enough time. I learned my lesson. I didn't do nothing wrong. I mostly stay home, mind my own business. Now all of this is happening. Then I find out that she's out here, and now she's missing. I'm wondering the same thing. Where is she? Where'd she go? I know people run away, but there's got to be a reason.
You can just see and hear in Steven's voice that he has a lot of sympathy for what he's gone through. It is just kind of mind-boggling to think, why would a man who's about to sue Manitowoc County for $36 million and spent 18 years in prison commit a crime like this to someone that he has no ill will towards? She helps him out with his cars, takes photographs for him. It's all so disturbing. So a lot of people have been asking what my thoughts are on season 2, and I really was happy with it. It was good to see more of all the people that we like to see. I think the one thing that really stood out is how old his family's getting, how old everyone's getting, and it's really sad to see his mom and dad age even more. I've said that through a lot of my videos, and it is really sad, and I just hope that he can get out before they pass, because his mom more specifically wasn't looking too great. Her health seems to be declining, and both his parents are very old, and if you look at his brothers, they're getting old, so hopefully they can get this figured out. The big thing that stuck out as far as Kathleen Zellner was that she actually says on the record there she would put her life on the line that Steven is innocent. And I know she's supposed to believe Steven, but for someone of her status and how many cases she's handled, how many people she's been in front of, guilty and not, for her to say that, I think that's incredibly powerful, and I think it is something that should hold a lot of value. Other things that stuck out were the brain fingerprint, when they talked to that scientist from Harvard and how she presented it to Steven. If this comes back negative, we have a lot of problems because it's 100% accurate. And Steven enthusiastically agreed to do it. That alone tells you a huge sign that the man's innocent. And the fact that he actually passed the test. I really like the tests that Kathleen Zellner conducted with her team as far as the cargo door on the RAV4 and the blood spatter, and how they placed the body in the back with two people, one person, they threw it in, they set it in, and they showed how it just wasn't consistent with any of those things happening, and how the spray on the cargo door was from cast off. something going down, hitting up, and flaying blood black. That was really interesting to see and gave a really good perspective to see the visualization of it. So that was interesting. And along with the other testing that was done was the hood latch, when they talked to Dr. Carl Reich and how they had 3 separate people touch the hood latch 5 times each, and 4 of the 15 tests came back with some DNA on it. And the amount of DNA, this is what's interesting, such a small amount of DNA. But when you look at the graph of how much of the DNA was found of Stephen Avery's on that latch from when they tested it, the prosecution, detectives, it's an astronomical difference. It's like the only explanation of that is they had something of Stephen had his DNA all over it, was wiped with all over that thing, because the amount they found from the 4 of 15 tests that they did was so insignificant compared to that number they came up with for Stephen. I can't remember the gentleman's names, but when they were talking about the fire and how a body is burned, that was interesting, because I honestly thought the bigger the fire, the more a body would burn. But looking at it from a point of view where the fire needs to be contained to make it more hot, so the body would disintegrate more, be destroyed, that makes a lot of sense, because you think of cremation. It's in a small confined space. They push the body into the pit or the little furnace, and it burns to ashes. And those doctors were saying how the lack of ash and body residue wasn't nearly as consistent as it would need to be in order for what was said to have happened. Just everything that the prosecution and detectives did, how Kathleen Zellners goes into detail and just talks about every little thing they're doing. It makes you really look at Strang and Buting and think they're not bad lawyers, but they missed a lot of stuff. They missed a lot of opportunity to help Stephen and Brendan. The quarry was another big one for me, seeing the graphs and the maps of where the cadaver dogs hit, the scent dogs hit. That was really good to see where their Don property is, Manitowoc County property, the Avery Salvage Yard. That was really good to see it actually just presented the way it was. I think the quarry has so many clues and just information about what happened. I'm interested to see what happens going forward with this. And the last thing I want to just touch on with season 2 was how they ended it kind of with the coroner. And I didn't realize the coroner was so high up in hierarchy when it comes to the law when involving cases and bodies and bones and whatever, and how she was completely just brushed to the side. She found out on the news about the body, and she had to inquire on her own. Why am I not coming out there? When can I come out there? And Colburn and the whole investigation and the police shut her down. She eventually resigned from her job after being with it for like 15 years. And she states in the documentary how she loved her job, and what other reason besides intimidation and just being uncomfortable because wrongdoing was done would you want to leave something like that? She does not come off as a liar at all either. So it won't seem like fame hungry or anything like that. So ending on that corner was big for me. The way the bones were handled, and it's all so terrible. It's disgusting what happened here. So those are my thoughts. What do you guys think? Leave a comment below, and we're going to move forward here with those things that I talked about earlier, and we're going to start with Scott Bloedorn. So Scott Bloedorn is Teresa Hallbach's ex-roommate, former lover, and he was never questioned. He never needed to have an alibi, and that alone is concerning. And doesn't notice, they say there's opposite schedules, whatever, but very concerning. And then you see in the second season too how when Kirby talks to Bloedorn and he just blurts out Ryan Hillegas because they were going to name a suspect. That's interesting because they were friends too. So he should definitely be looked at a little bit more. I'm not saying he did it, but it's very likely that he could have had something to do with some part of this, especially if Ryan's implicated as deeply as we think. So this is just a page from Kratz's book. When Scott Bloedorn called Stephen Avery on Thursday, November 3, to ask about his appointment with Teresa, Avery said she's never shown up. And Zellner goes on to say, talking about this, Stephen Avery never spoke with Teresa's roommate Scott Bloedorn on November 3rd, 2005, or any other day. Law enforcement investigated these allegations and determined they were false. Then it goes on to his page on 163. Stephen Avery tells Scott Bloedorn, Teresa's roommate, that Teresa never showed up for her appointment on October 31st and is upset that he was even contacted in connection with the disappearance. So there's obviously lying going on somewhere, and we already know who and what Ken Kratz is. But the fact that Scott wasn't questioned, I find upsetting. Obviously, there's so much upsetting stuff in this, but let's take a look at Scott's body language in these news reports.
I know her very well, and it's a very hard situation to get a grasp of. He stopped by the job site where I was working at, and he just asked me if I had seen Teresa in a couple days. And it was about right then when it kind of hit me, like, no, I hadn't seen her in a couple days. And I feel terrible for her family. It's got to be hell. We don't know anything right now, and that's, again, you hear that, it's like a cliche, the hardest part is the not knowing, but it's absolutely true. Out of all the possibilities, what is the ideal one? It's that she's all right.
Now, I'm no body language expert, but I think I'm old enough to know where I've seen people actually sad, actually mad. You know when someone's being genuine or not. Most people can tell when someone's being genuine. And for the most part, through all that, it seemed all right. But the very end, it seemed a bit overdramatic, acting like, that could just be the way he is. I'm just speculating here, but just from looking out, not knowing, if I was just seeing that in a movie, I'd be like, that's bad acting. That's just my personal opinion. What do you guys think?
That she's all right.
All right, so what we're going to go over now is the notice of motion and motion for post-conviction relief. That's those big, huge, they weren't binders, but just pages and pages and pages that you see in season 2 where Kathleen brings to the state of Wisconsin, the circuit court, just to show her findings. And what I want to go over today is just the documents regarding Ryan Hillegas. So bear with me here as I read through some of this stuff and go over. This is probably might be the most boring part to some people that are watching this, but it does have a lot of great information, and you can get a little insight in what is in all those documents. The killer's post-mortem activities to conceal evidence and frame Mr. Avery. The killer wanted as much time as possible before the people close to Miss Halbach realized she was gone. As she received more and more phone calls, her voicemail box became full, something uncharacteristic of Miss Halbach. The killer, who knew the password to her voicemail box, deleted several of Miss Halbach's voice messages to buy himself time before Teresa's family and friends realized she was missing and began searching for her. Before her death, Miss Halbach was known to regularly check and respond to her voicemails. Family and friends were to call Miss Halbach and receive a message that Miss Halbach's voicemail box was full. It can be assumed that they would have been alarmed. When Miss Halbach's voicemail was discovered to be full on November 3rd, 2005, it triggered her friend and families to notify law enforcement that she was missing. The killer deleted voice messages from Miss Halbach's voicemail in order to prolong the window of time before Miss Halbach was reported missing, thereby increasing the amount of time the killer had to dispose of Miss Halbach's body and personal effects. The method of deletion in order to leave no record in Miss Halbach's cell phone records could only be accomplished in one way. Her voicemail had to be accessed from another phone by using Miss Halbach's voicemail password. Miss Halbach's phone records do not indicate that her voicemail was accessed using her phone after 2:12 p.m. on October 31st, 2005. This indisputable fact means the person who accessed Miss Halbach's voicemail prior to authorities realizing she was missing on November 3rd, 2005, had to be the killer who knew Miss Halbach's password, which would require to delete voicemails recorded to her phone. The killer knew Miss Halbach very well in order to know her password. Clearly, this person was not Mr. Avery. Knowing that he was likely to be a prime suspect due to his prior romantic relationship with Miss Halbach, the killer, who was highly organized, devised a plan to burn the body and plant evidence which would focus law enforcement on someone else. Because the killer found appointment details and paperwork in the RAV4, he knew Miss Halbach had an appointment with Mr. Avery earlier that afternoon. The killer formulated a plan to move the body and the vehicle near the Avery property, which was intent of planting the RAV4 on the Avery property and Miss Halbach's bones and electronic components as soon as the body and electronic components were burned in an adjacent gravel pit. The killer would have been familiar with Mr. Avery and his fame as a wrongfully convicted exoneree who was suing Manitowoc County. The killer wanted to control the investigation and direct it towards a single goal of framing Mr. Avery for the murder. To accomplish the goal, he volunteered to take control of the citizen search as a means of both staying informed and controlling the focus of the investigation. In his initial contact with law enforcement, the killer immediately attempted to misdirect their investigation by not telling them about his relationship with Miss Halbach and her relationship with other men. The killer participated in the discovery of major pieces of evidence, even going as far as leading searchers to the vehicle he planted. Once the vehicle was found on the Avery property, the investigation of any other potential suspects halted, and just as the killer planned. The whole case was focused on Mr. Avery. The killer duped law enforcement into focusing exclusively on Mr. Avery and helped them justify planting additional evidence to frame Mr. Avery. The killer planted the bones and the electronic devices. As the leader of the search team, the killer had unrestricted access to the Avery salvage yard and surrounding properties, closed off to public access. This was critical because the killer still was in possession of the burned bones and the electronic devices of Miss Halbach. Access to the Avery property allowed him to plant the bones and electronic devices of Miss Halbach in Mr. Avery's burn pit and burn barrel. The killer knocked out the RAV4's parking lot while trying to plant the RAV4 on the Avery's property. Mr. Avery did not see any front-end damage on Miss Halbach's vehicle when she came to his property on October 31st, 2005. Mr. Schmitz, an earlier appointment of Miss Halbach, noted that Miss Halbach's vehicle looked very new and did not note any damage. However, when Miss Halbach's vehicle was discovered on the Avery salvage yard on November 5, the driver's side parking lot was broken out and the killer had placed the broken light in the rear cargo area of the RAV4. When the killer damaged the vehicle, he did not want the parking light found anywhere other than at Mr. Avery's property, because if any pieces of the parking light were found elsewhere, the state's entire theory that Mr. Avery was the killer and the RAV4 never left Mr. Avery's property would disintegrate. The killer would be highly motivated to pick up the parking light if he had a collision with a post that knocked the parking light to the ground near Mr. Avery's trailer. The killer put the parking light in the rear cargo area of the RAV4 and planted the RAV4 on the Avery property. Only someone who committed the murder and or was involved in the effort to plant the vehicle on the Avery property would know the significance of the broken light, and that it had been placed in the RAV4 to conceal the fact that the vehicle was moved onto Mr. Avery's property from elsewhere. Northeast of Mr. Avery's trailer, between the Avery property and the cul-de-sac at Cuss Road, there was a metal post protruding approximately 2.5 feet from the ground. When the killer attempted to plant Miss Halbach's vehicle near Avery's trailer, he collided with the post, causing the damage to the front end of Miss Halbach's RAV4 and knocking out the driver's side parking light. He recognized he needed to retrieve the parking light because leaving the pieces of it in the field would show the RAV4 left the Avery property, contrary to the Mr. Kratz theory that the RAV4 never left the Avery property. Abusive history. Mr. Hillegas was Miss Halbach's ex-boyfriend. Mr. Hillegas and Miss Halbach knew each other since they were freshmen in high school and dated on and off for 5 years. Although Miss Halbach and Mr. Hillegas were romantically involved during their high school and college years, they were no longer together in 2005. Although Miss Halbach reported to friends that Mr. Hillegas continued to check her out despite being broken up for years. According to Mr. Pierce, a friend and colleague of Miss Halbach had been in a verbally and physically abusive relationship prior to or during her internship with Mr. Pierce. Miss Halbach interned with Mr. Pierce in 2003 during her senior year of college when she was still involved with Mr. Hillegas. Jealousy was the motive. While Mr. Hillegas maintained an interest in Miss Halbach, she was no longer romantically interested in him. Miss Halbach became sexually involved with her housemate, Mr. Bloedorn, in the months preceding her disappearance. Reportedly, Mr. Bloedorn was also Mr. Hillegas' best friend. Mr. Hillegas committed perjury on trial when he described Miss Halbach's relationship with Mr. Bloedorn as platonic and never romantic or sexual in nature. Current post-conviction counsel investigator Mr. Stephen Kirby attempted to interview Mr. Bloedorn for the false statement that he had made to police in 2005. Mr. Bloedorn refused to sit for an interview with Mr. Stephen Kirby, but when he was told that current post-conviction counsel planned to name a suspect in Mr. Halbach's murder, Mr. Bloedorn immediately blurted out, "You mean Ryan Hillegas?" Another point of jealousy for Mr. Hillegas might have been the fact that Miss Halbach, as part of her business, took nude photographs of men and women, and the activity led her to become sexually involved with one of her clients, Mr. Check. Mr. Check was married to someone else at the time. Miss Halbach kept the nude photographs that she had taken of Mr. Check and his then wife in the bedroom of her residence, a home that Mr. Hillegas frequented and moved into Miss Halbach's death. Check left a text message for Miss Halbach at 12:45 p.m. on October 31st, 2005. Mr. Check was completely forthcoming in his interview with law enforcement on November 4, 2005, and that he had texted Miss Halbach. He was not asked the content of the message nor to show the message to law enforcement during his interview. At no point did law enforcement attempt to obtain the text message from Mr. Check. Although Mr. Check did not have an alibi for October 31, and another witness has described that Miss Halbach had broken her relationship off with Mr. Check, but he continued to call her. Mr. Check did not meet the Denny requirements. For some unknown reason, Mr. Hillegas called Mr. Check on November 3, 2005. According to their phone records, this was the first time Mr. Hillegas talked to Mr. Check on the phone. Mr. Hillegas intentionally misled investigators. When Mr. Hillegas volunteered false information about when the parking light damage occurred, it raised red flags about his involvement in the murder and the effort to frame Mr. Avery. Certainly, Mr. Hillegas had no motive to frame Mr. Avery unless he himself murdered Miss Halbach. It is difficult to imagine a much more compelling motive to frame Mr. Avery than the one possessed by a murderer of Miss Halbach. The alleged motive presented by trial's defense counsel that MCSD investigators were trying to derail Mr. Avery's civil rights lawsuit against the pales in comparison to the killer's motive to frame Mr. Avery. Mr. Hillegas intentionally diverted investigators by reporting that the damage to the driver's side bumper and parking light of Miss Halbach's RAV4 occurred months before her disappearance and that she had filed an insurance claim for the damage. Current post-conviction counsel, through its investigator, has confirmed that Ms. Halbach never filed an insurance claim for this damage to her vehicle, and further contends that the damage to Ms. Halbach's vehicle occurred after she left the Avery property on October 31, 2005. The most reasonable explanation for Mr. Hillegas' intentional misleading of law enforcement regarding the damage to Ms. Halbach's parking light is that Mr. Hillegas wanted to divert attention from the parking light that was tossed to the rear cargo of the RAV4 by the killer when he was trying to plant the car on Mr. Avery's property and inadvertently hit a post on the Redon property. Mr. Hillegas would not want the searchers looking for other pieces of the parking lot on the Redon property, because if those pieces were found, it would destroy the state's narrative that after the murder, the RAV4 never left the Avery property. If the narrative implicating Mr. Avery was refuted, the investigators might begin looking at more likely suspects, such as Mr. Hillegas himself. Opportunity. Mr. Hillegas was trained as a nurse but was unemployed in October and November 2005. He had no alibi for October 31, 2005, the day Ms. Halbach was murdered, or the subsequent days when her body was burned and bones planted. Mr. Hillegas was never asked by law enforcement to provide an alibi for October 31, 2005. Trial defense counsel failed to conduct any substantive investigation of Mr. Hillegas, choosing to name him as a potential suspect at one point but failing to meet the requirements of Denny. Mr. Hillegas' cell phone records show significant gaps during time periods in question on October 31, 2005. There was a 6-hour gap, a time frame in which there were neither incoming nor outgoing calls, from 9:41 a.m. to 3:48 p.m. It's most likely that during this time frame, Ms. Halbach departed the Avery property, departed the Zipper property, and was killed after she arrived home at approximately 3:40 to 3:50 p.m. Ms. Halbach's day planner indicated that she wanted to get Sarah's stuff from mom at about 3 p.m. and do biz paperwork at approximately 4:30 p.m. Also, on October 31st, there was an over 2-hour gap in Mr. Hillegas' phone records from 3:50 p.m. to 6:01 p.m. Mr. Hillegas' phone records have an over 17-hour gap from 7:47 p.m. on October 31, 2005 to 1:31 p.m. on November 1st, 2005, during the time where Ms. Halbach's body was transported and burned. Subsequently, Mr. Hillegas had more suspicious gaps in calls. There was a 6-hour gap in phone activity on November 2, 2005 from 10:06 a.m. to 4:12 p.m. and a gap on November 3, 2005 from 7:31 p.m. to 8:10 p.m., the time when Mr. Avery reported seeing headlights on the property. His last call on November 3, 2005 was at 10:44 p.m. Mr. Hillegas did not make another call until 7:52 a.m. the next morning. On November 4, from 4:15 to 7:25 p.m., Mr. Hillegas received 21 calls from an unidentified hidden phone number. It is reasonable to conclude that the calling party intentionally hid the phone number and may have been law enforcement. It is during this time period Sergeant Colburn called dispatch to confirm the license plate on Ms. Halbach's car. Mr. Hillegas had access to Ms. Halbach's singular wireless account and knew her username and password, as evidenced by Mr. Hillegas' admission that he had used her username and password to obtain her phone records after she went missing. Opportunity to conceal and plan. Mr. Hillegas called Ms. Halbach's phone at 6:42 p.m. on November 1, 2005. Mr. Hillegas had admitted that when he called on Thursday, November 1, 2005, an automatic message played saying that Ms. Halbach's voicemail box was full. However, Mr. Hillegas' testimony is undermined by the fact that his call only lasted 4 seconds. By comparison, Mr. Avery's call, which also generated an automated message, that the voicemail box was full and lasted 13 seconds, more than 3 times longer than Mr. Hillegas' call. Sometimes after that call and before the call of Mr. Pierce, when her voicemail box was full again, the killer deleted voice messages. Scratches are visible on the back of Mr. Hillegas' left hand in the footage taken prior to the discovery of the RAV4 on November 5, 2005. Current post-conviction counsel's forensic pathologist, Dr. Blum, has opened that Mr. Hillegas' injuries are consistent with scratches from fingernails. Dr. Blum has confirmed that photographs of Miss Halbach taken close to her death established that her fingernails would be adequate length to inflict such scratches on Mr. Hillegas' left hand. The most obvious motive for burning Miss Halbach's body would be if the killer had a known or established relationship with Miss Halbach and his DNA was on her body from a struggle of rape. Additionally, the burning of the body would allow him to move or plant the bones and divert the suspicion away from himself because he is likely to be a prime suspect due to his prior abusive relationship with Miss Halbach. Mr. Avery would not need to risk detection by others by burning Miss Halbach's body in an open pit 20 feet from his trailer. Mr. Avery could have crushed the vehicle and disposed the body on the hundreds of acres surrounding his property. Mr. Hillegas accessed Miss Halbach's voicemail box. After hearing Miss Halbach's voicemail was full, Mr. Hillegas, who had no trouble accessing Miss Halbach's singular wireless account, would be able to delete some of her voicemails in order to prevent family and friends from becoming concerned by a full voicemail box. Clearly, the killer would not want to plan Miss Halbach's voicemail box to be full because friends and family calling her would be concerned about her well-being and contact the authorities. Miss Halbach's voicemail box had a 20-minute capacity. When Mr. Avery called Miss Halbach's phone at 4:35 p.m. on October 31, his phone call went directly to the automated messages, which indicated that the voicemail box was full, meaning her voicemail box was occupied by 20 minutes of voicemails. When Miss Halbach's colleagues, Mr. Pierce, called her on November 2 around noon, her voicemail box was full, meaning her voicemail box was occupied by 20 minutes of voicemails again. According to Agent Fassbender, report documenting his receipt of voicemail records from Singular, 5 minutes and 11 seconds worth of voice messages were left between when Mr. Avery found Miss Halbach's voicemail to be full and Mr. Pierce found Miss Halbach's voicemail to be full. Therefore, to make room for the voice messages that were recorded between Mr. Avery's call and Mr. Pierce's call, at most 5 minutes and 11 seconds worth of voice messages were deleted by the killer between when Mr. Avery called and when Mr. Pierce called. After Mr. Pierce called around noon on November 2, 2005, 3 minutes and 45 seconds of voice messages were recorded to Miss Halbach's voicemail before her voicemail was widely reported to be full on the evening of November 3, 2005. Therefore, space in Miss Halbach's voicemail had to be freed up for more voicemails to be recorded, so at most 3 minutes and 45 seconds worth of voice messages were deleted after Mr. Pierce called. The killer could have deleted Mr. Check's text messages without leaving proof that he entered the phone. Scent tracking dogs showed that Miss Halbach's vehicle was moved onto the Avery property. Scent tracking dogs gave trained alerts in the wooded area south of Cuss Road cul-de-sac and between Mr. Avery's trailer and the Cuss Road cul-de-sac. Some of the scent tracking dogs deployed in the search for Miss Halbach were trained to detect decomposing human remains. These dogs are trained to give alerts when they smell human blood or other decomposing tissue. The other scent tracking dogs deployed to the Avery property were trained to follow the scent of a living person when given an exemplar scent. Example, the insole of a shoe belonging to Miss Halbach, as was used in this case. The live scent tracking dog's alert established that Miss Halbach's vehicle, with her body still inside, was driven between Cuss Road and Mr. Avery's trailer and was in the wooded area south of the Cuss Road cul-de-sac. A human remains detection dog gave a trained alert in the wooded area south of the Cuss Road cul-de-sac, where a suspected burial site was discovered. Many dogs converged on the suspected burial site. A shallow ditch had been dug wherein plastic similar to tarp was discovered. Sergeant Colburn persuaded everyone it was not a burial site, but no evidence supported that conclusion. Other scent tracking dogs led their handlers through the Redont pit, traveling from the place Miss Halbach's RAV4 was discovered at the Jambo Creek Road, where the new witness observed a vehicle matching the description of Miss Halbach's entered the Redont and Manitowoc County pits prior to its discovery on November 5, 2005. Mr. Hillegas was aware of Sheriff Pogle's intention to conduct aerial surveillance of the Avery and surrounding properties on November 4, 2005 to search for Miss Halbach's vehicle. Mr. Kratz admitted that the RAV4 was not visible in the footage taken during the November 4, 2005 aerial surveillance. After the flyover ended around 6 p.m. on November 4, the killer drove Miss Halbach's vehicle to the southeast corner of the Avery property. A new witness described seeing a vehicle similar to Miss Halbach's RAV4 followed by a white Jeep entered the Redont pit from Jumbo Creek Road using an access road immediately south of the house. Only the white Jeep returned. The killer parked the RAV4 facing west, although the vehicles surrounding the RAV4 all faced east, and tried to conceal the RAV4 using tree branches, cardboard boxes, and a rusty car hood as an explanation for why the car was not seen in the flyover video. The killer returned to the Avery property with Sergeant Colburn in the evening on November 4, 2005, under the pretense of helping Sergeant Colburn search for Miss Halbach's vehicle. Mr. Avery's brother Chuck told police that on November 4 he saw an unidentified headlight in the salvage yard that evening. Sergeant Colburn, without probable cause for search warrant for the Avery property, unwittingly relied upon the killer, a civilian, to find Miss Halbach's vehicle on the Avery property. The individual who helped Sergeant Colburn on the RAV4 on the Avery property was most likely the killer because he was able to enter the Avery property and quickly located the vehicle in the dark or with limited lighting. His words, "It's hers," shouted when he looked in the vehicle and clearly recognized her personal effects, established that he was a close friend of Miss Halbach's. Sergeant Colburn called MCSD dispatch to confirm Miss Halbach's license plate number. November 3, 2005, Chuck called Mr. Avery about seeing headlights in the area where Miss Halbach's vehicle was found. By the time Mr. Avery went to check out the sighting, the headlights were off. Mr. Avery called Chuck back at 7:25 p.m. to report that he could not see the headlights. The headlights were from Sergeant Colburn's personal vehicle that he had a friend of Miss Halbach's with him to search the Avery property without a search warrant because he did not have probable cause to be on the Avery property at that point in time. Mr. Hillegas' activities after Miss Halbach's death. In the days following Miss Halbach's disappearance, Mr. Hillegas spearheaded the citizen search for Miss Halbach. Mr. Hillegas misrepresented his identity when he became the leader of the search. Ryan Kilgus, Kilgus. Kilgus. Hillegas continued to misrepresent his true identity as evidenced by the Wisconsin Department of Justice report on November 16, 2005, in which he was still described as Ryan Kilgus, a very close friend of Teresa's. At that time, Mr. Hillegas provided addresses from where Miss Halbach donated blood and plasma and addresses of her doctors, including a cardiologist and an OBGYN and a dermatologist. Mr. Hillegas also provided a phone number for Miss Halbach's pharmacy. Mr. Hillegas made maps for searches and directed volunteers as to where they should be looking for Miss Halbach. He also made a hand-drawn sketch of his investigation, noting that he found a condom wrapper on the corner of the lot by the first house on Jumbo Creek Road. Mr. Hillegas directed Pam to search the Avery property and gave her a phone number, a direct line to Manitowoc Sheriff's Department in case she found anything. Mr. Hillegas gave other search parties only maps, but he gave Pam a camera in anticipation that she would be the one to find the RAV4. After Miss Halbach's death, and despite his prior abusive relationship with her, Mr. Hillegas moved into the house shared by Mr. Bloedorn and Miss Halbach while the searches were going on in order to maintain tighter control over investigators' access to Miss Halbach's belongings and home. Mr. Hillegas was present almost every time investigators entered Miss Halbach's home, even months after Miss Halbach was killed, and frequently directed investigators to items of evidentiary value, such as her dirty clothing, including lingerie, the boxes for her phone and camera, and medical records. It is reasonable to conclude that he would also have had access to Miss Halbach's subkey and given it to law enforcement to facilitate the subkey being planted by Sergeant Colburn and Lieutenant Link. In addition to maintaining control over Miss Halbach's home and possessions, Mr. Hillegas personally searched property surrounding the Avery salvage yard and entered the salvage yard on multiple occasions. Even after November 5, 2005, the police allowed Mr. Hillegas through checkpoints to come to search the area. On November 7, 2005, Mr. Hillegas accessed the Avery property from 9:03 a.m. to 9:53 a.m. Mr. Hillegas made a second entry to the Avery property on November 7, 2005, exiting the property at 4:28 p.m. Suspiciously, Mr. Hillegas never logged into the property when he entered the second time, meaning there's no way to know when he arrived or how long he had access to the property. This access to the salvage yard would give Mr. Hillegas opportunity to plant the bones of Miss Halbach and her electronic devices on November 6, 7. Now that investigators were already focused on Mr. Avery, on at least one occasion Mr. Hillegas also accessed the Avery and surrounding properties using a fake name, Ryan Kilgus, Kilgus. This would also explain why, despite previous searches of the Avery and Jonda burn barrels, bones were not discovered until November 8, 2005. Mr. Hillegas was not asked to provide an alibi. When asked by police about his last interactions with Miss Halbach, Mr. Hillegas testified that on October 30, 2005, he dropped something off for Miss Halbach at her house. Suspiciously, Mr. Hillegas does not recall what he delivered to Miss Halbach, nor can he remember anything about what time of day it was when he went to Miss Halbach's residence, even though this was supposedly the last time he saw Miss Halbach alive. At first, Mr. Hillegas told law enforcement that he was just a friend of Miss Halbach's, despite authorities eventually learning that Mr. Hillegas was Miss Halbach's ex-boyfriend. He testified that he was never treated like a suspect in any way. On the afternoon and evening of November 4, 2005, Mr. Hillegas received 22 phone calls from a number or numbers with no identifiers. It is reasonable to conclude that law enforcement officers were calling Mr. Hillegas in connection with conducting an illegal search of the Avery salvage yard using Mr. Hillegas to access the property. In his pretrial hearing testimony, Mr. Hillegas stated that although he was not sure how many times he talked with Sheriff Poggle on November 4, 2005, they spoke at least once. Mr. Hillegas did not recall whether he had contact with investigator Wiegert on November 4, 2005. On November 5, 2005, with information obtained from law enforcement and 22 unrecorded calls on November 4, 2005, Mr. Hillegas directed Pam to search Avery's auto salvage. While Mr. Hillegas provided only maps and missing person posters to other citizen searchers, Mr. Hillegas provided Pam and her daughter Nicole, the only searchers allowed to access the Avery salvage yard, with a digital camera and Calumet County Sheriff Poggle's direct line. Clearly, Mr. Hillegas knew that Pam would discover Miss Halbach's vehicle. Pam located Miss Halbach's vehicle on the Avery salvage yard, among 4,000 other vehicles on a 40 acres of uneven topography. Within 30 minutes of her arrival, a true statistical improbability. It is clear that Pam was provided information pertaining to the location of Miss Halbach's vehicle by Mr. Hillegas. So this is an interview with Crime Watch Daily. I'll put the full link below, but it's just with Kratz and Fassbender and just how they're going to die going to the grave. Just they'll never admit to any wrongdoing in this case. Any, which is shocking. Even if they didn't want to just full on say, yeah, we know what we did was wrong. Not even just one or two things. Just no guilt, no shame. Fassbender shows a tiny bit of empathy, though, which I thought was interesting. So we'll take a look here.
And I was named the most hated man on the internet. I was on the same list of people like Hitler.
No kidding, bud.
The millions of people that watch this should be angry, not at the justice system, but at these two filmmakers. I wrote this book to set the record straight, show that Stephen Avery's exactly where he's belonged.
So I haven't read that book. I'm sure it's filled with just lovely information. But this is that same book that Kathleen Zellners talks about how Bloedorn never spoke with Stephen Avery.
My opinion was agenda-driven. It had a narrative that it wanted to further. They use facts, they use the case, but they use it in such a way of manipulating the data and splicing into further their narrative that Stephen Avery is innocent and that there's this big setup.
That didn't happen.
That did not happen.
Kind of just like how when you interviewed Brendan, there was something you wanted to follow, a certain narrative?
There was that potential conflict of interest. Manitowoc Sheriff had requested the Calumet County Sheriff to take over the investigation. Calumet Sheriff agreed to do so. Same thing happened with the prosecution.
Somebody had to step up and say, this shouldn't happen. This is wrong. The jury saw the complete evidence. The jury wasn't fooled.
Obviously, we know that the jury did not see the complete evidence. I wanted to show all these just because these two will go to their grave lying about this.
The car was secured. No one touched or went in the car. It went down to our crime laboratory in Madison, Wisconsin, where they analyzed it. They find male and female blood in the RAV4. Some of the blood comes back to Stephen Avery.
And again, back to that blood. No mixture.
So how did that swipe of blood end up in Teresa's RAV4? Investigators say through this cut they found on Stephen Avery's right hand.
Because it certainly is apparent, at least to most people, that if you stick that key in and your cut is on this finger right there and stick that key in and you turn it, that swipe is almost perfectly lined up with someone that would do that off of that blood.
That swipe actually looks like a swab.
According to the documentary, Teresa's key found with Stephen's DNA on it was only discovered after 7 searches of the property, even though it appeared to be hidden in plain sight.
And they advanced that exact claim at trial.
Are you kidding me? These are good officers, and I know very well. No.
Liars.
What viewers of Making a Murderer never saw was the non-blood DNA police also found on the latch under Teresa's hood.
The non-blood DNA was most likely from skin cells from Stephen Avery's hand. That's really hard to explain, and so the filmmakers chose, rather than to explain it, they chose to ignore it. They've been asked why would you not put that in? They said that wasn't very important. They know that was a central part of my closing argument, and the jury certainly heard it. The jury knew that that was important.
Again, going back to what we saw in season 2 and the latch, they're still going strong with that. The 4 out of the 15 samples that came back positive for DNA on that latch, the astronomical difference between the two found between, well, the 4 found and comparing it to Stephen's 1 does not make sense for someone to actually just touch it. If someone lathered it up with DNA, whatever they used, that might make sense. But I doubt Stephen, if he was going to touch that, he'd be groping it and just rubbing as much DNA on there as possible.
I just have a seat, Brendan.
How did you determine what happened to Teresa?
Well, a lot of that was an interview with Stephen's nephew, Brendan Dassey.
How many times did Stephen shoot her?
About 10.
You get the bleach from?
In his house, but in his bathroom.
But was this confession coerced?
Yes.
Do you think, though, he had the ability to truly comprehend what was going on when he sat there with you, and that everything he said to you could be used against him?
I do. Provided a lot of information that he didn't have to provide.
Did he invite you in?
Yeah.
Okay. And where was she?
In his room.
He said he saw her in the bedroom, restrained. He claims to have had sex with her. Stephen may have stabbed her, and then ultimately shooting of her, where he says he shot her twice in the head.
All these things he says, like when you just know what Zellner has done and what the information she's provided, he sounds so ridiculous.
All right, I'm just going to come up and ask you, who shot her in the head?
He did.
Why didn't you tell us that?
That's where they stopped that video. This is the actual video.
Why didn't you tell us that?
Because I couldn't think of it.
Now you remember it? Tell us about that then.
Daddy shot her with his .22.
You were there though.
Yeah.
We didn't tell him anything about that. We didn't know about that. That is detail that he provided.
But didn't she say something about she was shot in the head? So him knowing Stephen has a gun, guns, maybe he would say it's a gun that Steven has. If he's been in this room with you guys for how long, if you guys have been manipulating him, if you guys have been trying to push your narrative.
We end up getting another search warrant for that garage. And during that search, 2 bullet fragments are found. One toward the rear of the garage behind all this stuff under I think it was an air compressor. That same bullet fragment is found to have Teresa's DNA on it.
Whoa, who cares? We all know that it's planted. You planted his DNA. Why wouldn't you plant hers too?
Part that Making a Murderer absolutely omits, does not talk to the audience about, is the fact that that bullet is forensically traced back to the gun that's hanging over Avery's bed.
Ballistics tests confirmed the bullet was a perfect match to Avery's rifle confiscated months before.
Now, process that a little. If I were to plant evidence, now I got to get Steven's gun. I've got to fire the bullet from Steven's gun. I got to recover that bullet. Now, I got to find Teresa's DNA and put her DNA on that bullet fragment. And then I got to get back in that garage at some time and put it in there. And on top of it, why, if I was going to plant it, why would I put it in the back of the garage under a compressor? Why wouldn't I put it somewhere where someone's going to see it?
What do you think should happen to Brendan Dassey?
I'm going to leave that at this point for the courts to decide. I feel a lot of empathy. I feel that if not for Steven, he isn't where he should be.
And as far as Steven Avery goes, is he where he belongs?
Absolutely. He did this. He did a horrendous thing, an evil thing, and he is where he belongs.
I think it's interesting that Fassbender says he has empathy for Brendan. So that must mean if he's not convinced that Brendan's a killer, cold hard killer, and everything that he said was just not coerced, the truth, why would you have sympathy for someone or empathy for someone in that situation, even if you do say, if it wasn't for Steven? That is a tell to me that he has remorse because he knows what he did was wrong. So what we're going to go over now is just that part of the Crime Watch Daily video and him talking about the sexting and what was said and him trying to make it seem like it wasn't that bad.
Let's talk about the sexting. What was going on in your head that you would be so inappropriate with a domestic violence victim?
Well, at the time, I was using a combination of prescription drugs. I was using Vicodin and Ambien and Xanax.
Oh, great, a junkie. Let's read these texts. It was nice talking with you. Feel free to text me between 8 and 4 if you are bored. Have such potential. See ya, Ken. Your favorite DA. Disgusting. You know he wants her to text between 8 and 4 because he's at work and he's not home with his wife.
Kratz lost his job as DA. His law license was suspended for 4 months, and he checked himself into a clinic for sex addiction.
After your sexting scandal made the news, at least 4 women came forward, and the Department of Justice did investigate their allegations.
They did, and they were decided to be or found to be without merit.
No text yet today. I'm feeling ignored. Are you even up yet? Kratz followed up with, according to Radar, the woman replied that she was ill. Kratz offered to bring her soup and a margarita, which she declined. This article, I'll put a link in the description. At 11:30 a.m. on the same day, the victim told Kratz she was ill. He text advances become more aggressive.
The Making a Murderer filmmakers had to know that those 4 allegations were dismissed. And the question that I would have for them is, if you knew it wasn't true, why'd you put those in this movie? Why'd you put those allegations that were made against me several years afterwards? The answer, I think, is clear, that I'm the villain.
Still wondering if I'm worth it? Can I help you answer any questions? He persisted as the woman shut down his advances. Why would such a successful, respected attorney be acting like he's in 7th grade? Are you worried about me? I know this is wrong. I'm such an honest guy and straight shooter, but I have to know more about you. Are you the kind of girl that likes secret contact with an older married elected DA? The riskier, the better.
It's villains very intentionally. Me, because I was the lead prosecutor, and I think because of my personality, which at the time wasn't, all that great.
No, it's actually because you're a scumbag. Again, disgusting. You should never lie to me. Obviously, we have talents and this to offer that the only is intrigued by, or you would have called me creepy.
I have admitted to narcissism, and I had admitted to being kind of a jerk a lot of times.
And then there were the more serious allegations brought up against the then married prosecutor at the end of the documentary.
There were some things that came out about you, one of which is that you were sexting and having an inappropriate relationship with a woman who was a domestic violence victim. How do you explain that part?
I asked to meet this girl for a drink, for a beer, after her case was over. I called her a hot young nymph.
Oh. It would go slow enough for Shannon's case to get done. Remember, it would be special enough to risk all, he texted the victim, alluding to the fact his sexual fantasy about her would last the duration of her former boyfriend's abuse case. When the woman didn't respond, Kratz kept the text coming by demeaning her and talking himself up. Hey, miscommunication. What's the sticking point? Your low self-esteem and your fear you can't play in my big sandbox? Who the fuck talks like that? My big sandbox? What an egotistical maniac.
Look, it's clumsy, it is stupid, but it wasn't sexual. Having said that, every time I make these explanations, it sounds like excuses. It's the last thing I want to do here. I'm not a victim. I put myself in that position.
Kratz did lose his marriage and much more as a result.
Ha! Good. So that last little bit there, the last video, was just before they actually get into the sexting, but that's just like, what was said in the text, and that's what he said before. It's ridiculous. All right, so that was a really long video. I appreciate you guys if you watched it all the way through. I love this case. I'm really sad it's a real thing, though, unfortunately, because it still gets overlooked, I think, that someone was murdered. That person's not coming back. So I'll keep making these videos. I don't know what else I'll make it on, honestly. So if you guys have suggestions or anything that you want to see specifically, I can kind of dive into it and make it, maybe, if enough people ask for it. But yeah, again, let's just keep hoping Brennan and Steven get some justice and the real killer gets what they deserve. And if you haven't subscribed, please hit that subscription button. It helps out a lot. Like, share, and I'll see you next time.